Welcome back to our second and final set of theater sessions. So we're kind of continuing to experiment here a little bit with audience interaction, and we'll continue to get better at it, I hope. Usually when you not that what was going on was bad. We're usually you go to a conference, it's a lot of bucket filling, it's a lot of 2 days of PowerPoint presentations. So we were just trying to do something a little bit different for this afternoon, and we'll be back to more traditional PowerPoint presentations the rest of the week, and some creative ones. Okay, so again, what we're going to do is we're going to walk back through, so we're going to just kind of talk a little bit about our next issue, which will be, no, it's not that one. It is this one. So it's project permitting. So this was one of the 12 issues that we identified. We have Aaron Wilson from smallish engineering firm called Wilson Water Group, a boutique.
Oh.
And Dan Birch is kind of more than a boutique water conservation district, one of 4 in the state. Dan is the deputy general manager, and Aaron Wilson is the chief stockholder and whatever else for Wilson Water Group. So we'll have them talk about project permitting. So as you remember, we surveyed the members. We asked them, what do you want to hear about? And had that long list of 20 issues, one of which was project permitting. And so the survey said, there's been a lot of conversation about how is project permitting being streamlined. That was something that was identified in the water plan, right? We're gonna streamline project permitting. So people wanted to hear. We asked them, what do they want? Not what was their major issue, but all these questions are, what do they want to hear about from the Water Congress? That from the Water Congress was an important piece. And then almost universally, as I said earlier, people wanted to hear about what are the experiences with others? What are others' experiences with project permitting that works, and what's been going well? We've got Mike Applegate over here, and Dan, or Blaine Dwyer, that have done a lot of work with project permitting, I think, like a little bit during your careers and stuff, and have some familiarity with that. So a lot of this community works a lot in project permitting. So one of the questions we wanted our speakers to talk about is, where do you get information now about project permitting, and what problems do you see about trying to engage with that? And hopefully they'll engage with you as well about how do you learn about project permitting now? Is there something that we need to do that uniquely we could fill that role of, given another limitation? So with that, I'm going to introduce Aaron and ask you can either stay seated or engage with the audience however you would like to. And we actually have 2 microphones, so I'm going to pass this one to you, Aaron. And yeah, we'll just go ahead and do that now.
And
the next one we'll give to is Dan Birch. So there you go. So you have your own microphone. Don't lose it.
I have arrived. I have my own microphone.
and we can walk around and ask people to talk and hand them the microphone, so it can be really cool.
Please, yeah. The more you do that, the better. The audience have gotten very used to that, and will be disappointed if you don't do that.
Okay, so we're going to start with, I think, just asking the audience a couple of questions. First of all, I want to just know, because I know the answer, how many people think that the permitting process generally takes too long? Anyone not think? How about, does everyone believe it should be a fairly long deliberative process? Should be. Does everyone think it should be? Hi, Meg.
Don't the consultants all think that? That it should be a very long and expensive process?
Well, I noticed that the environmental group here raised their hand when I asked that question. Just long and deliberative process.
Painful.
Painful. Laurie. So I actually really wanted to ask you guys more questions. Permitting is not my area of expertise, so most of my view of what permitting is sort of from the world of assisting with technical analysis and not actually doing more of the process that I think Dan's been involved with a little bit more. And I think a lot of you have been involved in a lot of the more onerous process that goes into this. So let me ask another question. So I'm just going to keep asking questions until I get somewhere where I can actually offer some advice or something good. So I think in recent years, the process has become much more collaborative. And from my view, it's working better when the folks who may potentially not agree with what you're trying to accomplish through a new project or a new water supply system is, it's working better when people are coming together earlier. What I am trying to struggle with, and hopefully we're all going to talk about this and you guys can help, is what Water Congress can do to help facilitate the process, and what we can do to upfront get the right people at the table. And Dan, I know you have some probably opinions about this. I'm going to give you the microphone.
Well, I'll just use.
He's got one as well.
We gave him the better wired mic.
Well, the River District has been involved with project permitting on our own, and we've also engaged more or less indirectly in other project permitting, like related to the Gross Reservoir enlargement and Windy Gap firming. And so we get to see it from both sides, and we've experienced some of the difficulties in permitting, and we have experienced some of the time and costs associated with that. My own personal experience was when we permitted the enlargement of Elkhead Reservoir. The permitting with that generally went pretty well. We did our 404 permit for that. We did at the end of the process. From submitting an application to receipt of our 404 permit took a year roughly, and that was done as an EA that the Corps of Engineers performed for us at no cost. So that was really simple and straightforward. I think part of the reason for that is we did up front some of the stakeholder work that needed to be done for that project, which is nowhere near the kind of stakeholder work that would be involved with a NISP or a gross reservoir enlargement. But the thing I want to say is that one person's streamlining in permitting is another person's steamrolling. And you have to be cognizant that there's two sides of the issue, and those views are represented here in the group. They're probably in the small minority, but I think the question fundamentally becomes, how can you get the stakeholder involvement that you really need, make it meaningful and substantive, and also result in a process that I was just talking with Harold Evans a couple weeks ago about their permitting process for Seaman Reservoir. They're, I think, 14 years into it and somewhere around $20 million. And I don't know that they're really very much further today than they were when they started. And so from that perspective, you certainly would have to say there's got to be a different way to go about this. That it's not going to happen immediately, but certainly you ought to be able to get further in 14 years than where Greeley has gotten. So that's my perspective in permitting, but I think the fundamental question for those of you in the room today is, what's the role for the Water Congress to play in this issue? Is there something for the Water Congress to either facilitate a discussion or help facilitate improvements to the system? So maybe with that, we'll kind of throw it out to the group and ask for comments or any questions that you all might have. And that fundamentally is where we want to get today. What should the Water Congress be doing? Is this a priority of the Water Congress to take on and try and facilitate some type of improvements or some type of solution? And don't all speak at once, please.
From the perspective of a local water provider and coming to the Water Congress for the last 10 years. I remember several specific discussions that addressed this. I remember Mark Pfeiffer and John Friedel discussing the differences in permitting of Prairie Waters and SDS. And I remember a discussion that included panelists from the water providers as well as from the recreational and the environmentalists several years ago that was very informative. From my perspective, I don't get into those big projects all that much. If I do, it's very peripherally. But a lot of local water districts will wind up somewhere along the line getting their feet in the mud of a 1041 permit. And that, I don't know, some discussion of that, I haven't seen a whole lot at the Water Congress level, and maybe because each county treats it differently, and maybe we got to accept that, and it's not a one-size-fits-all.
I think that's a really good point. And when we talked a little bit about this in preparing, of if we were to talk about project permitting, at what level are we talking about?
Right.
You know, are we talking about local permitting, 1041 permits? We're talking about 401, you know, the certifications. Are we talking about other federal permitting? You know, where? Because the problem with this topic is people want to hear about success stories, but the context for doing that and understanding how I mean, Dan, when you permitted Elkhead, how many permits did you get? Remember?
One.
Just one. That's pretty easy.
It's a little bit simpler. But I think that's a good question. I think for the group, you know, you've got the federal permitting issues, you've got state water quality certification, you've got inconsistencies between how different state agencies work through the EIS process, federal, local. Do people see, is there, and we can all point to problems within any one of those, but is there one that really floats to the top of a priority of something that fundamentally water users, Water Congress members would really like to see addressed as a priority?
Aaron.
Thanks. Well, first I want to defend myself. I was not saying that project permitting should be longer. I was saying I think there is a purpose for permitting, but clearly it doesn't function as it is intended. Well, maybe it is intended, but as it should. So I don't want people to think I was suggesting these are longer. So I agree that this is something Water Congress should have a role in. I admittedly, I know there was a lean process that the state ran a year or two ago, attempting to identify locations, I believe, in the state process or pieces of the state process that could be streamlined. I admit I don't know what the results of that were. And if there were ideas put forward, maybe Water Congress could play a role in advocating for those things or continuing that discussion, because I think that's when Water Congress works best. It's when we have an open environment to talk about these issues. But I think there's two ways it could go. One is in the abstract, saying we know that these two agencies address these things differently. If it was all consistent, it would speed this up. That's a good place for us to advocate. Or is it that Water Congress is a forum for particular projects where you could come together and have working groups? The only problem I recognize is that's another working group in the permitting process, so maybe that's not helpful. But either way, I'm sure other people were involved in that lean process. I wonder if there were any outcomes there that Water Congress could advocate for, to say the state did identify these places where it could be streamlined. Maybe we want to work on those.
Yeah.
Was there any?
I don't know.
Yeah, was there anyone here who was involved in that lean process? Because I don't really know anything about it. But I mean, hopefully they were looking, one of the things that we hear all the time is that the state agencies aren't on the same board as far as permitting. So you're dealing with CPW, and they have a different view than the health department and then the Division of Water Resources. And that seems like something that maybe Water Congress could help with if there's a solution, and it needs to be maybe a legislative solution.
According to the state water plan, we're thinking that storage is our main problem, and maybe it could be that Colorado Water Congress could look at the permitting process for storage and have information on that to help those individuals who are trying to either increase or even start some type of storage vessel.
Are you kind of thinking more in terms of maybe a smaller type of project, not necessarily something like a gross enlargement, but something a smaller water user may be undertaking, provide some resources in that regard?
Floyd.
In this legislative session, there was a session on the lien. Yeah, and Eklund was active with it, right? Yeah. So there is a lot of work going on that at the state level, and I think has Senator Sonnenberg spoken already, or he's coming up? Is he here? No. Yeah, no, but he's. I'm going to quote him on Thursday, but he is definitely one of the major advocates and had a hearing last year on it at the local level. I think the only thing I would add is that nationally, you probably just saw that the president interacted with EPA and said we're going to lean out the permitting process there, and whether that affects Bureau of Rec and some of the other agencies we deal with. He's also in the process of changing the federal judiciary in terms of sort of their attitude and viewpoint on some of these things, in my opinion, so that there is probably federal changes coming that it would be of benefit to us to be through our Congress people and our senators and our lobbyists, et cetera, to be aware of, and maybe this organization could be a forum for that. Because there's definitely change coming down the road here in terms of the federal interaction. I worry that it maintains the deliberative part that addresses people's actual anxieties and interest groups, collaboration, as you mentioned, but yet makes the improvements we would like. We have a NISP project representative here, and it's been at least, 12 years, counting the supplemental, and 15 million, I would say, and it's going to happen. I think most of us, and even some of the major, I wouldn't call them opponents, but skeptics, recognize it's going to happen. But I would say it's still 2 years of grinding along here to get to where it ought to be. And I think much of that could be cut at this point. As you know, a significant amount of this is playing defense. You're trying to get ready for a court case.
Mike, I know you may not necessarily have the benefit of hindsight quite yet, but based on the experience you've had, I mean, what would you say about the permitting process in areas where, maybe there's fat or inefficiency or undue costliness in the process that could be trimmed without necessarily, going aside from important considerations?
Okay, yeah. When we talk about streamlining, I guess the first thing is the word streamlining doesn't mean shortcutting or sidestepping issues, not in my mind at all. The biggest problem that we've run into is that you don't have all of the decision makers and the agencies that are involved at the table at the same time. It's a sequential process where you go and you do one permit, get it done, the next agency looks at it and says, no, I don't like that, change this, then you have to go back to the other agency, and you need to sit down, get everybody who's making those decisions at the same table at the same time, define what the issues are that need to be addressed, and they all continue to work together, and that goes for both state and federal agencies, because this sequential process is just a total train wreck.
So you see more of a parallel process, and do you see a way that could work out effectively for all concerned?
I think it could. I mean, it just needs to be a directive that you're going to have all of these agencies become stakeholders in the process, and they need to participate actively.
Is there something that's keeping that from happening now? I mean, this is my ignorance on the planning process. Is that possible if you set it up that way, or is there something that forces it to be sequential at this point?
I guess it's just, in my mind, I guess it's the way it's always
The way
been
it's been
done. I don't see any reason why it couldn't be done differently.
Okay. So that goes to what we were talking about earlier, about having the right people at the table from the start, and that would be the right federal agencies as well. Blaine has a question or a comment.
So I think a lot of what Mike's talking about in terms of the sequential organization is a result of how a lot of the EISs are set up, how the NEPA compliance is set up, and who's invited and to be a cooperating agency, and which agencies then accept that invitation. And that's what we're starting to try to figure out better, is which agencies to engage up front and how to get them to fully engage, to streamline that. So I think the trend is in the right direction that way in terms of how you handle that, but a lot of that is also driven by the applicant to have input on which cooperating agencies to engage in and how you control that information flow. And then Doug, going back to your question about how, Water Congress can specifically help. I mean, I think you do a lot already, but it may not be apparent to people, because so much of what Water Congress does is get people from different walks to engage with each other, and you develop more trust relationships that allow those dialogues to take place, even though you may not be explicitly involved in dispute resolution, for example, on an issue on a permit. Don't underestimate the value of what you're already doing. The second thing is there's things you're doing. Earlier we were talking about conservation. A big issue with a lot of the federal permitting processes for new storage is defining that defensible purpose and need. And so many times that gets hung up on what's the demand level, and that's affected by how much demand side management is being done. So there are components where Water Congress can take pieces and not have responsibility, if you will, for addressing an overall permitting process. Another thing I was going to say is I think people will really learn a lot from case histories, both good and bad. So the more the programs include information on not just, gee, I'm frustrated that when I started on Windy Gap, my son was 3 feet 1 inches tall. When the permit was received, he's 6'2". It took 3 feet of human growth
3
to
feet
get
and
that
2
permit.
inches.
But not to just make comments like that, but to explain what those challenges were, so that people can take lessons learned from the both good experiences like Dan's on Elkhead, and more difficult experiences, and apply it to their own situation. So that's just an information thing. Another thing that we can do is really, I think, engage with what NWRA is doing, National Water Resources Association, because they really look at kind of the permitting and federal interaction process overall, and we are the state affiliate. And to really make that information and whatnot available. And then the last thing I'm going to say, Doug, I promise, or Aaron, or Dan's moderating. You guys are moderating, aren't you? The last thing is maybe the most important thing that Water Congress can do is do no harm. There's enough challenges out there. I did get a kick when on the break I actually pulled up a newsletter that talked about the executive order that was just signed last week to expedite infrastructure permitting, right? In the same newsletter, the next 2 articles were about how the public comment period was extended on WOTUS and the Corps of Engineers water supply rule. So I was like, well, okay, let's hope this works. So anyway.
I think those are great comments. I wanted to just throw in a couple observations. When I started to get involved with the Water Congress many years ago, it was kind of having it was strictly a water buffalo group, and I think and I give Doug the large part credit for this and others, but you know, it's a bigger tent that the Water Congress has. But I think two things. Importantly, you know, the environmental representatives that we have sitting here in the room today are in the small minority. And so maybe inviting and encouraging more participation. I think especially with regard to permitting, the other thing that we would really want to have more involvement from are the regulatory agencies. You know, to a certain extent, we're preaching to the choir here. And I think, you know, we could use somebody from the Corps of Engineers and EPA and the CDPHE, and invite them to be part of these proceedings and be part of the meetings and be part of, if we're going to have an outreach session on permitting, let's try and make sure we get people there involved in participating in that we need to.
Good. I think all that is extremely helpful feedback. There's our little happy picture, so we'll put that up there. So it's just kind of a relaxing kind of thing, so we can. Yeah. So it's obviously an emotional topic, and a point of frustration for many of us, I think. But there's a lot of different ways we can communicate about project permitting besides just the written word. It's the conferences and events, it's the webinars, it's how do we get, you know, maybe even convening discussion groups to work on these things. So I think that's great. Any other closing out comments on project permitting? Okay, we're going to move on to the next topic, and I'm going to actually have to run next door because I am on another panel. So I'm going to turn the rest of this session over to our moderator for our replacement moderator, Peter Levish. Peter has just finished your law degree and an LLM at University of Wyoming. Masters in Environment and Natural Resources, and are currently looking for possible employment opportunities. So if this would be a good chance, if he does well, consider that to be an interview. And now the pressure's on. Okay, with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it up. First, I'll thank Aaron and Dan. And I'm going to turn it over to Peter and take you out for the rest of the afternoon, and here he goes.
Okay, so the next key issue that we're going to discuss today is project updates, and Paul Fanning and Katie Knoll will be our speakers. So I'll turn it over to them as soon as they're set.
It's cool. We get the A-team moderator. That's. Oh, is he still in the room?
So from the members survey, there were two things that came out. I'm not 100% sure, but what were certain models for innovative thinking and what partnerships are being formed during these projects. And I guess you guys can provide more of an update on that than I can.
You have notes. Go ahead.
I know, those were actually my to-do list for later. But
Well, I'll pitch in.
so I think our charge here was to talk a little bit about project updates and, you know, the communication surrounding project updates. And I guess my first question is, what are the projects that you're interested in? We just heard about the project permitting, so are those the projects that everyone wants updates on? Or are they other projects like stream restoration or watershed restoration projects? Like, what are the projects? I mean, that's a real vague term. And also, following on that, if this helps your thought process at all, like, why do you want updates? Because I know I always want to be informed about everything, and I always want to be current on everything, but everything is a lot of things. So I get overwhelmed, and so I kind of am curious, like, what are the projects and why do you want these updates? Kind of will help tailor the communication on them, I think.
One thing that just occurred to me, I mean, as we're talking about permitting and just projects in general, I think the bigger projects for me are a little more daunting. Understanding the ones that are the 15-year projects or the 10-year project that it's going to take that long to permit. I mean, that's probably the rest of my career, and I haven't done. I've had a little forays into federal permitting processes, and I've done a few 1041s and things like that. But, you know, for me, it's scary going into one of those because you know you got to get it right, and it's going to take a long time. And if you don't, it's going to be really painful. So I think the more you can learn from the collective wisdom of the group in that process to set you up for success and to make those go right from the start instead of having to retrace steps along the way is certainly helpful. But
So as that relates to Katie's comments, it would be on,
it's a little bit of both. I
but
mean,
primarily
kinda,
the big
yeah.
projects that are kind of terrifying that
Yeah.
you think we should share some information on.
Well, speaking from just the tail end of the Gross project, I think even if you do it right, it seems like it just goes on forever anyway. So no worries there. You can't really go wrong. So it sounds like maybe, so the projects that we're talking about, is that kind of what is that what everyone's kind of interested in, is these big permitted kind of capital style projects? Is that kind of the consensus in the room?
Way in the back. Oh, we have to get it on the recording though, so.
Well, I'm not sure. I think those projects are important. I guess looking at your 3 bullets there, these might be more along the line of collaborative projects, along the lines of some of the basin type implementation things. Because one that would be of concern on the West Slope is the endangered species, both on San Juan and Colorado. And so we want to see the scorecard, and we kind of keep up with that. But anyway, just we're all kind of looking for that measurement. Are we making progress? Is there still a delisting in sight? That kind of scorecard, whether it's a physical, multi-decade process or an ongoing collaborative watershed environmental process. So I wouldn't totally limit it just to the physical. I think I've been watching NISP, not as close to Gross. I think those are important for, because what happens on the Front Range tends to draw on the West Slope, as we always know. So, but I would broaden the thinking personally.
We have another question? Comment?
Hi, Amy Beatty, Executive Director of the Colorado Water Trust. I don't think you have consensus in the room, at least from my perspective, about the big projects, because if you are in project implementation business, and I think that's from nonprofits all the way through larger municipalities, you never really know what you're going to confront. And so in the spirit of models for innovative thinking, I actually happened to learn about an entity that wanted to go from a direct diversion to infiltration galleries, and at the time it didn't seem applicable to any of the work that I was doing, but I found it interesting. And then later, in working on a project where we were trying to figure out some solutions for a diversion structure that was taking water from the river, but we needed to bypass our own flow, infiltration galleries became part of the conversation. So I don't think we really know when we're going to see something that we can carry forward into our own work unless we get out and see things. And another really excellent example is that we had been invited up into the Pacific Northwest to look at some of the work that was happening up there in bringing a community of agricultural producers together to leave a little bit of water in the river, and they had a certain amount of water they were looking for between restoring some flow to the river and leaving agricultural lands productive. And they had this model that I thought, oh, well, that's interesting, and that's really specific to this particular basin. And turns out about 6 years later, we're in a conversation with a group of irrigators on a particular river who said no to several tools that we had, and the last thing standing was this actually very collaborative process that occurred up in the Pacific Northwest. So I think as a water community, the best thing that we can do is get out and see each other's work. It may not be relevant to us today, but certainly 5 years from now, 6 years from now, 7 years from now, you may be confronted with something you didn't expect, and then have all of these ideas that you've seen over the years to pull from.
One thing that we would like to hear from you is, regardless of the type of project, where are you getting most of your information now? There's a second part to the question, but I'll save that for after we get just a little bit of anecdotal feedback as to what is your source of information at this point in time? Here come to Mike.
Paul, I'm lucky enough to and privileged enough to be serving on the Arkansas Basin Roundtable, and a lot of projects come through the Roundtable, and you go to almost as many Arkansas Basin Roundtable meetings as I do, that every one of them has to go up and recapitulate their project and make their case financially for a water supply reserve account that eventually articulates to CWCB for their action or some other source of funding. Those case studies, some are small, some are something I'll never do until the next day when I walk into my office and it gets on my desk. I think that those case studies are important, and I'd like to see them from around the state, not just in Walsenburg and in Trinidad and up in
Leadville.
Salida, you know, or in Pueblo, yeah.
There was another straight back.
Yeah, Angie Fowler, Glenwood Springs, Colorado Basin Roundtable, very active in that process and had the pleasure of developing and working with others on the Basin Implementation Plan. And I'm kind of along the lines of what Amy was saying, these partnerships forming. And I guess being very active in implementing some of the projects that we identified in the BIP, I'd really like to find a way to foster partnerships across our roundtables, because we're all so hunkered down and we're all so very busy right now trying to implement what we've got going on. And unfortunately, some of the feedback that we give other roundtables and other basins is based upon a project. And the conversation could be more proactive, and the conversation could be more positive on, you know, share with me what your projects are. Let me start thinking about where my projects are and start forming partnerships more along the lines that way. I'm on the grants chair for the roundtable as well. And it's really hard to try to do, like, I try to equate it to, in my consulting role, a capital improvements project. Yes, we have a basin implementation plan, but can we be more thoughtful in prioritizing which projects are already there, reaching out to those members, and then going across the basin and trying to understand if there's a mutual benefit instead of being so reactive roundtable to roundtable because of how we're prioritizing or not our projects. So I'd like to see a partnership that's more regular among roundtables to talk about top projects and try to start thinking how we can move those forward. There's got to be some mutual benefit.
Okay, hang on to the mic, and we'll get to you in a second, May. Leading question for you then. Do you have in your imagination some sort of mechanism or framework for that? And is that something that should come from the IBCC, CWCB, or is there a role that Water Congress might play in the communication of that additional communication between the VIPs?
Sure, I can't answer that there isn't a mechanism, but my involvement at the roundtable as a chair and a voting member, I'm not active in what mechanisms people are capitalizing on. I know that water rights users and historical users, you know, the HUP calls, I mean, there's a lot of conversations that go on outside of the context of my involvement personally in the roundtable level, but I think that the Water Congress could probably support trying to pull those partners together. I know that the IBCC and CWCB host a annual summit of roundtables, but I don't know if that's the right venue for it or not. But I would really appreciate, you know, being able to go, you know, talk to Arkansas Metro as, you know, someone who's really integrated into what these top projects are and just trying to understand, is there a mutual benefit or not, and as opposed to being so reactive and creating a negative conversation.
It strikes me in my memory from attending a couple of those summits that there really wasn't a lot of opportunity for that kind of interchange that you're talking about. So perhaps we may be able to just advocate for a little bit of a shift in the frameworks that we use at those summits.
So I just mentioned that in the partnerships.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question up here. Manny? Okay, next one's yours, whatever it is.
Paul, I was just going to mention the IBCC and the summit meetings, so that's all been covered.
Well, make something else up. You've got the microphone.
I don't know if Water Congress would be the one to carry that ball because it's already set up, I think. And it might be that maybe we could talk to them and partner with them, or force them into doing more of a show and tell of the projects they've already done.
I think since I'm going to add my 2 cents in and kind of summarize, I think, a little bit, since this is on video for Water Congress, it sounds to me like you all are interested in a variety of projects, but not necessarily like a play-by-play, like, oh, this organization just made this step towards the resolution of their project or are advancing this way, like not in any kind of newsletter format, but more as a final ending case study, like here's what we did, lessons learned, like that kind of thing. And I think there are a lot of opportunities for that. First of all, I think Water Congress could play a role in that at their conferences and, kind of showcasing some of those projects. But I also think Travis Smith brought up an interesting concept earlier today in a meeting that I was at, that Colorado Water Congress could play a role more as a like an information clearinghouse, or he said, what did he say, traffic direction, I think.
Right.
So they could play a role as sort of advertising these opportunities that maybe the Foundation for Water Education is, they do a lot of tours to these kinds of water projects. So they could play a role, and Water Congress can play a role in directing you over there or to the IVCC tours or something like that. So they're not having to like put a lot of their resources into updating you on these projects, but they're connecting you to ways to be updated, in addition to, maybe picking out some particularly relevant ones for their conferences to update. So that's for the benefit of the video. For the board members watching later, I feel like that's a nice summary. But do you guys all kind of feel along those lines, or do you think Water Congress could be doing something differently or more?
Kind of piggybacking on that, I know I get information. A lot of entities will be putting out constant updates on their major projects. I know Andy, thank you, Colorado Springs Utilities, on the Southern Delivery System was very, very active in trying to get a lot of public information out on a continuing basis. And we've heard from Aurora in a lot of different places about their Prairie Waters project. So that's why I was wondering how people get that. I sometimes have trouble remembering how I got on those particular email lists or whatever, so that I get those regularly. But it's very spotty, and if more people in the state, if we did create that sort of a clearinghouse, that people in the various organizations that are doing project felt like they wanted to share that information, and then we would just provide the links, because obviously Water Congress staff does not have the time and the resources to be creating all of those case studies just out of doing their own research. We have another question here. Comment?
Oh, there he is. I was looking for him. He's right behind me. I'm Everett Kistler, Central Colorado Water Conservancy District. We've been doing work with Groundwater Management Districts Association throughout the United States, and I'm on the board of directors. We do a lot of interchange twice a year, having conferences, and the interchange of multiple ideas between cities and agriculture on groundwater management, storage, banking, and surface waters put into groundwater, and recuperation of recharge and augmentation. It is a stimulus that has created a lot of different ideas throughout the western United States and many of the eastern and Mississippi Valley states. Mississippi Valley does a lot of groundwater usage, which has surprised a lot of us. We did not realize that they used that much, but it's water quality based situation. And this has a lot of interesting and utilizing capabilities for all of us in agriculture and municipal and industrial. We've seen a lot of problems that were created by heavy industrial, by the United States Air Force, and seen a lot of plumes of many endangering chemicals and cancerous type product. And seeing a lot of corralling of that by
So you mentioned that you have a lot of that exchange happening at conferences, regular conferences and meetings?
conferences twice a year.
Is there like a newsletter component that
Yes.
continues then
Yeah.
also?
Yeah, we have newsletters coming out of the office in Dumas, Texas, and a lot of communication between other individuals that start developing those type of exchanges. I'll just put it that way, exchanges that have become very good exchanges between agriculture and our cousins in the cities.
So you're suggesting that might be a good model to kind of,
It's a developing model. Things change and things are utilized in both sides.
okay.
We have working structures that they would like to have information of. California has utilized a lot of our structure development on our augmentation and recharge sites.
Yeah, or I would say for something like that, I mean, it's even something for the Water Congress to know about for people that are seeking that information to be able to connect them to that, sort of along the lines of that traffic direction. So Water Congress isn't providing that information directly, but can connect you to organizations that have that kind of exchange.
Yeah. So just a little information.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, this isn't I just don't think this is like a super deep topic. It's basically project updates and how do you want to get them, which I think we've heard a lot of suggestions. Does anyone have any other thoughts on how they want to receive project information? I mean, I'm not hearing send me a weekly newsletter about this stuff, so which I can agree with. So I've got kind of conference updates, information clearinghouse tours, going to look at other people's projects and kind of learn about them through what are already existing, you know, kind of updates and tours and showcases of that kind. Anything else that would be helpful? I'm guessing you also don't want to read like 80-page white papers on these things either, so I'll just eliminate all the bad options for you.
I'm seeing thought balloons of a gondola ride
Yeah, I know.
over everybody's heads.
That's kind of where I'm leading. I'm like, so everyone's done, right? We're ready for a beer.
This might be a last call of a different kind here, so.
Done. Amy Beatty says it's so, and we're done.
Almost.
That's on video.
I do think, though, it's important to do just a tiny bit of wrap-up for you here. I want to thank
Sorry,
all of you
Paul.
who've been here. And there again, this has all been captured. The staff and the communications committee, on which we both serve, will be trying to corral all of the input. And just remember, there have been 2 other parallel sessions dealing with 8 other topics in addition to our 4, corralling all that information, getting it put together, number one, for the communication committee to work with the staff, but also to deliver to the board, the Water Congress board, to make more sense of what we've learned from the member survey and be able to serve member needs even better with communication. And in every one of these, partnerships has always come up because we have limited resources, and there are other resources in all your organizations and other cousin organizations that will make that move forward. So this might have seemed a little bit amorphous this afternoon, but it is leading to some very concrete action on the part of Water Congress staff and communications committee. So thank you for that. And anything else, Katie? I might be forgetting.
Dismissed.
Thank you.